Good morning, and thanks for inviting me to this conference with such esteemed people. So I'm very honored to be here and to speak to you today. I have to say that when I received the invitation to take part in this conference, I was a bit surprised because the topic of the conference, the future of history, implied that let's say that the subject of the conference was the role of the architectural historian. And I have to say that I'm not an historian of architecture, and I'm not saying this out of modesty, but I'm also not a scholar of architecture. I'm an architect, a practicing architect, especially interested in the urban scale, in urban design projects rather than really architectural projects. And therefore, in that kind of practice, history has been a fundamental interest in my work. But I've always approached history within, I have to say, a rather explicit operative dimension. And therefore, actually, the confrontation with Tafuri's critique of operative history for me became quite important, not to actually dismiss, as Amy said before, Tafuri's critique of operative criticism or operative history, but more to understand what was the purpose of such critique and how that critique could be neither simply accepted to court, but not even be dismissed within actually the way we can practice in a more, let's say, projective way history. So it's actually, this will be the point of view in which we'll approach the conference. A second note that I have to make is that the presentation I will give today come from a larger project, which I'm at the moment conducting with a group of researchers, Ph.D. researchers at the Berlage Institute, and which actually concern the history of labor and in the way actually labor has informed the development of architectural form and its implications within actually the scale of the city. Of course, I don't have the time now in this specific, let's say, presentation to really clarify the way labor is here understood. I have to say that within the, let's say, political theory, the definition of labor is perhaps one of the most interesting and radical discussion, precisely because in a way this sphere for many thinkers and philosophers addressed the fundamental aspect of the human condition. Perhaps it's good to remind at least two positions or definitions of this category. The one, of course, a very important one by Hannah Arendt, who in The Human Condition, she divided actually the human condition in two fundamental spheres, labor, work, and political action. And Arendt, in fact, thought that fundamental precondition for the political was precisely the separation, the possibility of separating the sphere of labor, which for Arendt is a sphere where the species reproduce itself, and therefore a sphere driven by necessity, from the realm of politics, which she understood as the realm of the full accomplishment of the human nature within its aspiration to freedom and to political action. And of course, she wrote this book, as you know, in 1958, in a moment where, in fact, these two spheres were completely overlapped, to the point that, in fact, in her book, she lamented the way the sphere of necessity, driven by labor and production, completely invaded, in a way, disintegrated the sphere of the political. And in fact, as you might know, in her definition of labor, she advanced a rather subtle criticism to another fundamental, let's say, address to the sphere of labor, which is the one advanced by Karl Marx. Unlike Arendt, Marx understood labor not as let's say, a segment, a sphere of the human condition, but really as its totality, as let's say the purpose in which we can really define the human essence. And for Marx, actually, capital exploitation consisted precisely into, in a way, completely fragment the totality of labor as the accomplishment of human nature, and to separate subjects from their means of actually addressing labor and the means of production. So I think that of course, this definition for me is these debates across history between Hannah Arendt and Marx is very important. On one hand, it's true that, as Arendt said, it's rather radical to reduce human subjectivity to the sphere of labor. At the same time, historically speaking, it's also true that we can say that labor has unfolded through history as a totality by, in a way, constituting the totality in which circulation, consumption, and other spheres of the human condition becomes exactly a totality. At the same time, labor is also the pool in which a very specific subjectivity has emerged, the worker. And in a way, we can say that this subjectivity is not a passive subject that has simply been exploited by capital, but is also a subject that has been active within and against capital, and has in very precise, let's say, historical times, forced capital to evolve, to basically advance its means of organization of labor. And therefore, I'm very interested in the historicity of this active subject and the way it can be considered not just a sort of passive projection of capital, but, and also of the environment in which this subject has developed itself, the city and its architecture, but also a subject that has triggered this condition to evolve and to take the form of the city and the architecture as we know it. So this sort of operation to revise this relationship between labor and its subject, the worker, and the city and architecture, in a way forced me to revise Manfredo Tafuri, let's say, historical project that, as you know, consisted in a rather subtle and articulated critique of architectural ideology, meaning the way architecture since the 15th century, so since actually the beginning of primitive accumulation of capital, has consisted in a sort of apparatus, not simply in building, but in an apparatus made of representations, made of forms, whose aim was not simply to shelter or to frame the subject, but also to be persuasive and to construct ideological narratives. So in a way, Manfredo Tafuri's historical project was a critique of the sort of role that architecture had played during its history from the beginning of architecture as a discipline, the 15th century, to basically the 20th century. And therefore, one of the subtitle of this presentation is precisely the relationship between architecture and labor struggle. And here, of course, I'm using the subtitle of Architecture and Utopia. As you remember, the subtitle was Architecture and Capitalist Development. And I'm actually replacing capitalist development precisely with the subject that, in a way, has triggered capitalism itself to develop. First of all, I think it's very important to understand the historical context in which Tafuri advanced his critique of architectural ideology. As you know, this critique was first advanced in a famous essay published by the journal Contropiano. And the critique actually was meant to, it was a blueprint for a more larger project that, in a way, one could see running through the entire work of Tafuri to basically demystify the representational role of architecture and to see the way architectures contribute to develop very specific subjectivity. And of course, one of the fundamental aims of this critique was precisely the critique of what Tafuri called the operative criticism, which actually is a critique that Tafuri already advanced in his very important book, Teoria e Storia dell'Architettura, published in 1968. First of all, what Tafuri actually criticized as operative history, as Amy said, the meeting between the practice of history and the agency of planning was the reformist ethos that characterized the Italian post-war period, in which actually the country was dramatically developed, let's say advanced from a society based on a very backyard economic system to one of the most industrialized countries in Europe, and this in a very short time between the 1950s and the 1960s. Actually, what happened in Italy at that time was precisely what happened already in the US in the 1930s. A massive welfare project through which the capital was trying to basically advance the fundamental subject that capital is constantly meant to tame and develop, which is basically the working class. So in a way, Tafuri's critique of operative history was, in architectural terms, a critique to the welfare state, as much in the way the welfare state was, in a way, embracing the progressiveness of modern architecture and transform it in what at that time Mario Tronti would call the plan of capital. The way capital was somehow embracing the entire scale of production, not only concerning production as an isolated moment, but the whole chain of social facts, from production, consumption, to living, to education. And of course, it's not by chance that precisely in that period, many historians, such as Bruno Zevi or Giulio Carlo Argan, in Italy were busy into re-editing or reintroducing the great tradition of modern historiography, from Pevsner to Gideon, as precisely this sort of reformist project that in a way was promoting modern architecture as the reformist project of the city. And of course, the wave of class struggle that took place in Italy at the end of the 1950s, at the beginning of the early 60s, was precisely aimed to demystify the, let's say, progressiveness and its techno-utopian aspiration, its emphasis on planning and programming the city, because actually this sort of reformist ethos was concealing the fundamental trigger of such a capitalistic development, which was the rebellious initiative of the working class. One of the first critique to this, to the reformist ethos that took place in Italy in the 1960s was advanced by a group of political militants called operaisti. Here you see an image of them. You see actually the three main figures of this group, Raniero Panzieri, Mario Tronti, and Antonio Negri, who actually based their critique to capitalistic ideology by, in fact, showing how capitalist development was tuned all the time to the rebellious initiative of the working class. The more the working class was constantly, let's say, pushing, challenging capital, let's say the apparatus of capital and its basic institutions, such as, for example, the welfare state, the more capital was forced basically to advance and to change its forms of organization of labor. This is actually a very important, let's say, critique, because Manfredo Tafuri's critique of architectural ideologies is rooted in this, let's say, in the operaist critique to capital. And this is actually precisely the problem, no? Once you remove Tafuri's specific critique from this historical context, and you assume Tafuri's criticism to operative history per se, it becomes a rather abstract, let's say, critique, no? Because in a way, history is always operative. Because it has always a purpose to reveal issues that are hidden by the way, let's say, narratives have established dominant, let's say, ideologies. But at the same time, if we really actually, and of course, the critique of ideology was a fundamental premise then to free the subject to again face the conditions of its exploitation. There is a famous sentence by Tronti in his famous editorial in England, which is actually what can be considered manifesto of the operaist. We too have worked with a concept that puts capitalist development first and workers second. This is a mistake, and now we have to turn the problem on its head, reverse the polarity, and start again from the beginning, and the beginning is the class struggle of the working class. Now, if we assume that this was the very root of the critique of ideology, meaning to reestablish the, let's say, the true process through which capital would develop, meaning under the constant threat of its fundamental subject, the working class, Tafuri's actually historical project appear as rather ambiguous, because Tafuri actually has, in a very precise way, explained the way capital has constantly undermined, transformed the architectural and urban structures of the city to the point to push architecture to basically its dissolution. But he have never fully clarified who was the subject behind such a development. And he actually somehow never clarified that the active subjectivity of the worker, in a way, was behind such process. In a way, to use a famous Marxian joke, Tafuri never explained the original, let's say, scene of the whole story, which was that capital developed itself because this constant threat moved to it by the working class. So in our research, we're very interested to revise this project, not to abandon it, but to clarify really the active subjectivity of the worker in the way the worker constantly push capital to advance its forms of organization, which of course imply all forms of production, included of course architecture and the city itself. So now I will simply show you three case studies, which in a way are developed within this research. So this is just a way to show you the way we are trying to revise this sort of agency of work and labor in the way to in its way to transform architectural form. And also I would like to then conclude these three examples with a short conclusion, advancing a useful category through which we can conceptualize this, let's say, outcome, the way actually architecture could be redefined in light of these developments. These examples are three. There could be many, but it's just a way to sample several case studies. The first one is, of course, the birth of Renaissance architecture in Florence in the 15th century. As you know, this has been one of the fundamental topic for Manfredo Tafuri, Renaissance architecture. I have to say that one of the, for me, very problematic aspects of the reception of Tafuri's work, also in Italy, but especially abroad, is always is the fact that his work on the Renaissance has been always understood as a moment of retirement of Tafuri from the engagement with the actual contemporary condition. I have to say this is not true. First, because Tafuri wrote on Renaissance architecture through whole his life, from the beginning of his career, 1960s, to the end of his work. So in a way, the Renaissance architecture has been perhaps the main, let's say, subject of Tafuri's work, I would argue. And the second is that Tafuri was interested to start from there precisely because it's there that the subjectivity of architecture starts to take the form that we know within modern history. And of course, one very interesting aspect that Tafuri really, in a way, emphasized in his let's say, description of Renaissance architecture is that Renaissance architecture is not just about building, but is really an attempt to create representations through architecture. So architecture is no longer meant to simply solve the city, but to create a specific subject. So since Renaissance architecture, the central goal of architecture is to create a specific subjectivity. This is actually the problem of architecture that starts precisely from the 15th century. Now, it's interesting to see how this problem arises in a city, Florence, which in the course of the 14th century had a huge political and turmoil, which was driven by the reorganization of forms of production within the city, namely the transition from an agrarian, let's say, society to a proto-industrial society where wage labor would play a fundamental role with basically, yes, I'm almost there. And in fact, this, this means that I will reduce my case studies to 2, or maybe to 1. And so these sort of, let's say, turmoils, in a way, can be seen as the background in which the first radical experimentations with perspective and modularity in architecture, as represented by the work of Filippo Brunelleschi, in a way were a sort of reaction to that development, a way to, in a way, move that sort of organization of labor from the very intricate topography of the medieval city to something that, to a form that was much more controllable and in a way also that implied through the building of architecture a sort of latent expandable project for the entire city, where in fact standardization and division of labor was playing a fundamental role. Another case study, which I think is also very interesting, is the rise of modern architecture in Germany between the 19th century and the 20th century, another fundamental topic that Tafuri addressed several times in his books. What is interesting is that one of the characteristics of Germany between the end of the 19th century and beginning of 20th century is the incredible pressure posed by working class movements towards actually the organization of work. And in the way actually these incredible advanced worker movements, ranging from the Social Democratic Party to the Communist Party, challenge Germany after the First World War to shift gradually from heavy industry to material labor to immaterial labor, of which actually Berlin could be seen as one of the most radical examples. And in fact, it's not by chance that architects such as Mies and Ludwig Hilbert Seymour already in the 1920s proposed a series of experimental projects dealing with office space in which the architecture of material labor, the architecture of the factory, was basically translated in a new kind of post-Fordist condition in which actually the emptiness, the abstraction of the typical plan was seen as the project for a new subject, the Kopfarbeiter, the immaterial worker, and how, in a way, this let's say, architecture was, in a way, a fundamental, whether built or unbuilt, was a fundamental project in which the city itself was transformed from the 1920s to the 1960s. Now, to summarize just these 2 examples, of course I had many others, but I think these are enough to understand the revision of the historical project, is to somehow show that the development of architecture and the city did not necessarily imply a dissolution of architecture. On the contrary, architecture plays a fundamental role in reifying the forces at stake. But for me, actually, what this project called for is the revision of the very notion of authorship of architecture, which architectural historiography and Tafuri himself at the end attribute to the specific role of architects and their most immediate context, but that in a way imply a much larger let's say, context in which the history of production plays a fundamental role. And of course, for production, I mean not simply something that can be reduced to an activity, but really as production in general. Now, wondering how we could translate this sort of pattern of transformation through a specificity of architectural form, I think that perhaps a very fundamental project that could help this project to become specific to architecture is precisely the let's say, notion of Kunstwollen advanced by Alois Riegler at the beginning of the 20th century, where the attempt of his research was really to, on one hand, render architectural form in its precision and its consistency of object, but at the same time to question the, let's say, personification, the authorship of architecture through the specificity of the author. And in fact, this, the history of the way labor has, in a way, challenged and pushed architecture and the city to evolve, call for such a project, call for a project in which architectural form is not seen anymore as the imprint, as the index of a specific authorship, which is still the criteria in which architectural history evolved, but consider this larger context, which is the subjectivity of production and work. Thanks a lot.